Hello and welcome today to a new podcast episode. Today we're going to the cold far north of the United States to Minnesota, and we are joined by James Reed, a political scientist at College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. He is a graduate of Harvard University and the author of quite a few books. He started with the early Republic, but more interesting to us here for the Civil War period. He also published in 2009 Majority Rule versus Consensus, the Political Thought of John C. Calhoun. And today we're talking with him about his newest book, which also came out by the University Press of Kansas, Sovereign of a Free People, Abraham Lincoln, Majority Rule, and Slavery. So first of all, thank you, Jim, for joining me today and to
Well,
talk
thank you for
about your
inviting
new
me to this.
book.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me to this conversation.
My pleasure. So let's just dive into the topic, and let me bluntly ask, why another book on Lincoln?
Well, I have a section in my intro that under that title, "Why Another Book on Lincoln." My field is political theory, and for a long time, I wanted to write a book about Lincoln's political thought. I've read Lincoln for decades and taught him in courses, but I wanted to wait until I thought I had something new to say because, as you know, hundreds of thousands of books have been published about Lincoln, partly because the great complexity and importance of the period that he lived through. I think that is inexhaustible. But more specifically, I realized that the my contribution would be not some obscure corner, some undiscovered document, but a big theme right in the middle of the room that was insufficiently discussed, which was Lincoln's understanding of majority rule, his defense of majority rule. Both of those were essential to, first of all, Lincoln's belief and hope that slavery could be abolished peacefully, gradually, and democratically. He did not want a civil war. That was something that he saw as forced upon him. So he relied upon the possibility of creating an enduring national anti-slavery majority to gradually, politically and economically squeeze slavery out of existence. And so, um, and second, his defense of majority rule was central to his response to secession. The first seven slave states of the lower South seceded before Lincoln had even taken office. So that was not in response to anything Lincoln himself had done. He had just then been inaugurated. They seceded in response to the way in which millions of their fellow citizens had cast their votes. So it was a dramatic refusal to any longer to play by election rules. If the slaveholders' preferred candidate John Breckinridge had won the election, those seven preemptively seceding states would have remained in the Union and demanded that the free states respect the election results. So Lincoln's his understanding of majority rule and his defense of majority rule was central to what he hoped to accomplish before civil war was forced upon him. Then, once civil war was forced upon him with the Confederate assault on Fort Sumter, that then became central to Lincoln's own understanding of what the war was about. Yes, he wanted to preserve the Union, but more importantly than that, he wanted to preserve. He wanted to defend the principle that political disagreements were to be resolved by, as he put it, time, discussion, and the ballot box by peaceful ballots, not bloody bullets. And so, especially in the early years of the war, before the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln's own understanding of what the purpose was of the war and what his aims were in this war were to vindicate the democratic process against those who believe that they can tear up the democratic rules when the election results do not turn out as they want. So it is both a theoretical argument about trying to show how Lincoln understood majority rule, how he believed it could work, what it could do well, what some of its pitfalls were, but also in practice, his hope that slavery could be peacefully abolished. And then when that history didn't take that course, this shaped how he understood what the war was about.
And it's very interesting. I kind of had to smile when you said like majority rule and like the results of elections, and it so took me back to my own first book with some of the individuals I studied from the 48 uprisings that then came to the United States, and they were very active in the radical Republican movement in 1864 out of the Cleveland Convention.
Right.
And there's one individual who's just like, I hate Lincoln. I don't like the way he's doing this. And then instead of respecting the outcome of the election, the majority decision, decides to leave. And it always struck me as sort of like, these are individuals who advocate for majority rule. Like the majority in a democratic fashion should determine the course of the future. And then they turn around when the majority decides to go a route that they don't like, and they don't respect it themselves.
Yeah. Well, I think that, that in many respects, it is somewhat unnatural to respect election results. People have to learn to do that. People have to be taught, and if they've forgotten it, remember why it is we do this.
Yes.
And so I think that's true in the United States right now. People have to remember why we have elections and what they accomplish. And if you only respect an election result if your candidate wins, you really don't believe in elections at all.
Right.
And so in that sense, I think Lincoln's the thought that he put into majority rule and elections and defending them is something important and sacred. Yeah. That message is an important one for where we are in the world today, in the United States and elsewhere.
So let me ask you this, because so much about majority rule of like democracy revolves around the notion of the people, like the electorate, or however we want to define it. So how would you, or how would Lincoln, or how would anybody around 1850, 1860 see the people? Who would they consider part of this body who can vote?
Well, that's a complicated question.
Yes.
So Lincoln,
you're welcome, by the way.
Yes, Lincoln in a sense had two different answers to that. Lincoln acknowledged in principle, and this is true in his 1854 speech against the Kansas-Nebraska Act, that in principle, all adult residents of a territory were entitled to equal participation in making the laws by which they were governed. So consent of the governed in that democratic principled perspective would require not only the abolition of slavery, but also full civil and political rights for all citizens, regardless of race, regardless of sex. And Lincoln recognized that, but at the same time, he also recognized that the white Americans, who were the vast majority, were absolutely opposed to living to being social and political equals with Black Americans. Okay. So and Lincoln did not know how to resolve that. We can go into his attempts to finesse that. He in principle everyone, regardless of race, deserves full civil and political rights.
Mhm.
In practice, that he believed that was impossible in the United States because of white opposition.
Mhm.
That changed during the Civil War when hundreds of thousands of Black Americans fought for the Unions. So, from
Mhm.
Lincoln's point of view, that changed the calculation, made it much more possible to see um, Black Americans as part of the American people, as having patriotism toward the United
Mhm.
States. Um, so so you have, in one sense, a single people, but in another sense, you have a really divided people.
Mhm.
Um, you could even you could take the question further because um, if going back to John C. Calhoun, the states' rights theorist, Calhoun said there was no people of the United States. There was only the people of South Carolina, the people of Alabama, the people of
Mhm.
Mississippi. Uh, and so, Lincoln clearly believed there was a people of the United States,
Mhm.
that the individual member states, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, uh, all of those were part of this single people of the United States. And in that sense, as in many others, Lincoln and John C. Calhoun were coming from opposite poles.
Right. And it's sort of because your first book dealt with Hamilton and Madison and
Yeah.
Jefferson and sort of the early republic. It sort of reminds me of, I think it was Madison in one of the Federalist letters, kind of talking about also majority rule and
Yeah.
um, him being more worried about giving the right to
Yeah.
vote to too many people. How much did sort of the founding generation influence Lincoln's thought, and where did he break with that as well?
Well, of course, Lincoln admired the founding generation,
Mhm.
and he, I suppose you could say that he had the most generous reading of the founding generation. That
Right.
Lincoln believed that the founding generation had clearly marked slavery as an evil to be
Mhm.
abolished, if not immediately, then as fast as quickly as circumstances permit.
Mhm.
And Lincoln said that the founding generation had tolerated slavery only where some urgent necessity required it,
Mhm.
and had prohibited wherever they had power to do so. Um, I believe that's an overly generous reading of the founders as a whole. It certainly describes some of them. And it is true that the founding generation, and this includes James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, though they were slaveholders, they did recognize that slaveholding was a violation of the natural rights that they proclaimed in the Declaration of Independence. Um, but the real question is, how much did that translate into action?
Right.
And I, much as I admire Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, they did not act as though, Jefferson especially, did not act as though ending slavery was the most urgent thing on the
Right.
political
Right.
agenda. And unfortunately, I think Jefferson and that founding generation lost an opportunity with the
Mhm.
Louisiana Purchase, where,
Right.
because it wasn't an existing state, the federal Constitution did not give Congress the authority to abolish slavery in an existing state, but uh, Louisiana was new territory. Most of it,
Yeah.
outside of New Orleans, most of it was still untainted by slavery, and um, Jefferson did not, in practice, do much to prevent slavery from spreading to that new territory. So
Right.
I think Lincoln's reading of the founding generation was overly generous. Uh, but uh, Lincoln himself, I think, in, in, in Lincoln's favor, he was actually willing to act much more
Mhm.
strongly against slavery than the founding generation was. So, in that sense, you could say Lincoln's overly generous reading of the founding inspired him to act in the way that the founders ought to have acted.
Well, yeah, rights or wrongs made by or things forgotten by the founders. Yeah,
Yeah. I would
that's
say you mentioned James Madison and majority rule too. So,
yes.
let me describe some of the similarities and some of the differences between Lincoln and James Madison. Both Lincoln and Madison recognized that majorities could act unjustly. So Lincoln was not this uncritical. He did not believe the voice of the majority was the voice of God. He understood that majorities could act unjustly, they could be unwise. But for Lincoln, the alternative, which was to put permanent power in a minority, was even worse. So what majorities have in favor of themselves is that their injustices, their lack of their errors are correctable in a way that through deliberation, I mean, it doesn't automatically happen, through time and deliberation and shifting public opinion, the errors and shortfallings of majority rule can be corrected. In that sense, I think he and James Madison thought along similar lines. Madison, even though Madison in Federalist Number 10, Federalist Number 51, talked about the importance of slowing down majority rule. Still, both Lincoln and Madison understood that in the end, it still was going to be the majority that would rule. It's a question of you set up processes to make that majority more thoughtful, more deliberate, in the hope that its decisions will be wiser and more just. But there's no guarantee in that. Another respect in which Madison and Lincoln were alike was that Madison, when the John C. Calhoun's doctrine of nullification came along in the late 1820s, 1830s, Madison was still alive, and he very clearly and publicly denounced that as a perversion of the Republican principle and a perversion of the principles of the Constitution. That one single state could declare itself sovereign and overrule the decisions of the federal Congress, federal court, president. Madison thought was standing Republican principle on its head, which still required that ultimately the majority was the decision maker. In that sense, too, Lincoln and Madison were very much on the same page. There are differences. Lincoln was much more on factions and political parties. James Madison treated factions as an evil, but an unavoidable evil. You have to take account of them. They're not going to go away, but they were still disruptive. Whereas Lincoln had a much more positive view of a political party, of the kind that he sought to build as a Whig, and then especially as to build the Republican Party in the 1850s. He believed that a mass-based political party capable of winning national elections was the only way that you could address major issues like slavery, and the only way you could address them peacefully. He understood that. He viewed that if the Republican Party didn't exist, there would be no peaceful outlet for people's moral and political opposition to slavery, and would then necessarily take violent forms. So a political party for Lincoln was really important, and he saw that. I say this because political parties have such a negative view right now in the United States and elsewhere. I understand that Lincoln's political party was not a worshiping of one person. That is not at all the kind of party that he meant. A party was something that agreed upon a certain set of principles, and the party's candidates, like Lincoln himself in 1858 in the U.S. Senate election in in Illinois in his 1860 election, he was running on a platform, a certain set of principles that he considered, were kind of pledge of faith on his part.
Mm.
So political parties, as he understood them, were democratic. They went to the grassroots. They began person to person, face to face, and they were an alternative to violence. They were also an alternative to one man personalistic style of rule of a kind that Lincoln didn't practice that, and that's not the sort of political party he built.
I want to go back. So where you said, and admittedly, I was not aware that Madison actually had made a statement about nullification.
Yeah.
We it's an interesting part that we kind of forget that Madison is still there, and but then I think the part that I want to get to is the sort of irony, if you like, that in part Calhoun builds on the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which Madison and Jefferson wrote,
right,
as almost an attempt to nullify a federal law.
Yes.
And now
Right.
he turns around, it's like, no, don't. That's not what I meant to say there.
Yes. Well. Okay. So this would be a longer conversation, but in
Give the
my
cliff notes, man.
previous book on Calhoun, I argue that Madison actually was consistent.
Okay, that's
That
interesting.
that Madison's the Virginia resolutions that he drafted in 1798 did not envision that a single state could declare a law to be unconstitutional.
Okay.
And here there was a difference between the Virginia resolutions that James Madison drafted and the Kentucky resolutions that Thomas Jefferson drafted, which really do come close to the
Jefferson the radical.
Yeah, that Calhoun later picks up on. So I think Calhoun, by the time that Calhoun came along with nullification, Thomas Jefferson was already dead, had already died by that time, so was not in a position to answer. But James Madison was inconveniently, from Calhoun's point of view, still alive and responded publicly.
Right.
Their scholars will debate on whether Madison somehow reversed himself. There are people who take that stance, and I argue for his consistency. But in any case, it's unquestionable that in 1830, 1831, 1832, James Madison was clearly denouncing nullification of the sort. He also argued that there could be no constitutional right of secession.
Huh. Wow, we may have to get back together and do a second meeting one day and talk about secession and intellectual development.
Whole other rabbit hole to go down.
Yeah, that would be fun to just.
But these things are relevant to Lincoln because they were on his mind, and people understood that secession and Civil War had this back history to it.
Right, exactly, and there is that. People sometimes forget there is this long history that gates into the early republic when it comes to that secessionist thought process. But let's turn to some other aspects with regard to Lincoln, because it's actually, let's go to this because I want to hold off on party organization and the role of slavery until we're already halfway through but I was really stuck by you kind of talking about Lincoln's 1860 election and the southern states like not even having him like available, that people couldn't even vote for him. And that, like, when we started corresponding about 2 weeks ago after I read your book, of course, was like in light of, at the time, the Supreme Court of Colorado saying, like, we're going to take Trump off. Maine saying we're going to take him off. Illinois saying we're going to take him off. And now, like, just few days, like 24 hours, 48 hours before we talked, the Supreme Court ruled now that said, no, Trump versus Anderson, he can stay on the ballot. And in part, I think you have a very, let's start with, first of all, the relevance of your book. How much do you see your book also speaking from the past to the current situation in the country?
Well, clearly, I should first point out I was working on this book for more than 10 years. So
it's ironic how things catch up.
I had a full manuscript almost ready to submit to press when the January 6, 2021 assault on the U.S. Capitol occurred. But during the whole decade that I was writing this book, I could see that the United States politics was becoming increasingly divided. And it increasingly felt like what the 1850s must have felt like to the people who lived through that in the United States. And that decade did not end well. So I could see, as I was writing the book, that American democracy was deeply divided and heading towards some crisis, although I couldn't have imagined the form that it took. When the January 6, 2021 assault on the U.S. Capitol, it was not a spontaneous event. It was for the purpose of preventing Congress from doing its constitutional duty, which was to count and tabulate and announce the results of the presidential election. So in that respect, it was parallel to the act of the first 7 states seceding from the Union before Lincoln could even take office, because they did not like the election results. It was
and
a
in
dramatic.
The same way, you could say it wasn't spontaneous, what the seceding states did. It was very much planned and orchestrated.
And I would say too, the reason they did it, the reason that the argument for preemptive secession won the day in the lower South was that they believed that Lincoln's and the Republican Party's platform of democratically and gradually squeezing slavery out of existence was very realistic and likely to work if not immediately refused. So in that sense, I emphasize that because people often talk about Lincoln's idea of the ultimate extinction of slavery as though it's some vague, empty idea. It was not a toothless idea. It had real meaning for slaveholders. And they saw with Lincoln's election the real prospect that slavery would be squeezed out of existence over the course of several decades. And they were willing to go to civil war to prevent that. And it had to begin by dramatically refusing to accept the legitimacy of his election. Now, let me then, having said that, point to some differences. The secessionists did not claim that Lincoln had somehow only won the election because millions of fugitive slaves had fraudulently voted in northern states. They did not invent fables of a stolen election. They understood and acknowledged that Lincoln had won the election by the constitutional rules. And they simply said, we were refusing to play by the constitutional rules anymore. We are breaking with this Constitution and the nation. In that sense, they were more honest about what they were doing than the people who assaulted the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021. There were also the differences in the sense that the secessionists were not claiming the right to rule the country whose elections they had just rejected, only to break with it. Whereas the insurrectionists of January 6, 2021 did claim the right that the person they supported should continue to rule the country whose elections he had just lost. So both of those comparisons, I think, those differences, and ironically put the Southern secessionists in somewhat more favorable light, at least a more principled light.
Right.
And then the final difference is none of the, on neither side of the Civil War, neither Jefferson Davis nor Abraham Lincoln were seeking one man rule.
Right.
Had they sought it, they would not have gotten it.
Mm-hmm.
This was, in that sense, there was a still commitment to Republican principles on both sides of that divide.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, so there are parallels between the two events and also non-parallels between the
Mm-hmm.
two events. But going back to your question about the Lincoln being kept off the ballot and the attempt on the part of some states to keep Donald Trump off the ballot in 2024. I mean, those happened for very different reasons.
Mm-hmm.
The In the case of the effort of some states to keep Donald Trump off the ballot, they were referring to Section 2 of the 14th Amendment
Mm-hmm.
that banned somebody that from being a candidate for office who has incited insurrection against the United States.
Mm-hmm.
So that didn't have any parallel to Lincoln being kept off the ballot. Lincoln had not incited insurrection against anyone or anything. So Lincoln's being kept off the ballot in most of the southern states, most of the slave states. There were exceptions, which I'll come to. They simply did not want any anti-slavery presence in their states. Those states had done everything possible to prevent any anti-slavery speech, even of the mildest kind, from being printed, published, distributed through the mails. So, whereas to allow the Republican Party and its candidate, Abraham Lincoln in 1860, to allow them a presence, even though there was no chance of them winning. Right. There was no chance that the Republican Party was going to win the election in any slave state. But still, their presence was a public acknowledgement of anti-slavery views of a kind that the slave states had tried to completely eradicate from their public discussion. So that's the reason why Lincoln was kept off the ballot in all the states of the lower South. Lincoln was on the ballot in Virginia, Maryland, Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware. All of those were slave states at the time. He did receive, not close to a majority, but he did receive several thousand votes in Virginia, and especially in the part that later broke off and became West Virginia. Did best in Missouri. And the part of one of the things that I found from looking at the arguments for preemptive secession, why people thought why secessionists argued we have to get out now. One of the things I came across, if we don't get out now, this is coming from Tennessee, the Republican Party will openly run a candidate in Tennessee in 1864, right? Which of course they would. So they were afraid that over time, the Republican Party would begin to gain support, at least in the upper South, where slavery was less entrenched, and that some of these upper South states like Missouri, Maryland, could flip and become free states. So that's the reason why they wanted to keep them off the ballot. And, in that sense, the fear that they would not be able to keep him off the ballot forever was one of the motivations for the notion that they needed to secede before he could be inaugurated.
And based on the Constitution, it is within the state purview to run an election.
Right.
So...
There was much of election law now is in the United States is 14th Amendment, equal to protection of the law, 15th Amendment, franchise. In the before the Civil War, the federal Constitution said very little about how, said almost nothing about who could vote in elections.
Yeah.
And
Or
very
even
little
who's
about
the
how elections.
electors, like who picks the
Yeah,
electors wasn't even in it. So
right. The Constitution, all the Constitution does is specify for the Electoral College is specify the formula by which the number of the state's electors are determined, and some of the process about where they gather and the votes and some of the procedures that the votes are to be then counted in Congress. But most of most of election law and particularly everything connected with an equal right to vote is all post Civil War.
right.
Before the Civil War, because of slavery, there could have been no agreement on that among the states.
But I kind of was in part I wanted to ask about this because um there were a number of historians who wrote like briefs in support of the insurrection clause in the 14th Amendment and kind of keeping Trump off the ballot. And when I read that section in your book, I kind of was like, why don't we make this case? States in 1860 said, no, we're not going to let you vote for a guy that we think will be dangerous for the country or the state, which is a precedent to keep somebody off the ballot.
Yeah.
Why didn't we use that? It seems way more logical and more convincing than try and create a 14th Amendment case for somebody who isn't technically yet convicted of that crime.
Yeah. But in any case, that's all water under the bridge in terms of
Right,
the
yeah.
2024 election. So
true. Well, let's turn to
it will be determined by the voters. I think it's how Lincoln himself would have said. Ultimately, it is the people of the United States that have to make a decision of this kind.
Yeah. And that's a perfect segue over to parties, because I think that's another important part that you kind of talk about with regard to party development and Lincoln's role in it. And I was so reminded when you talked about, like, I think it was the 1848 election and how Winfield Scott just ran on nothing. Like,
that was 1852.
Sir, yes, 1852 election, and just ran on nothing. And Lincoln was like, you got to stand for something. People need to know what you stand for.
Well, and then Lincoln felt that way in 1848 also with Zachary Taylor. That he, for both Zachary Taylor in 1848 and Winfield Scott in 1852, although he supported both of them, privately he was very disappointed at the emptiness of their platforms, and in both cases hoped to give them more substance.
Right.
This is part of the reason why the Whigs didn't survive much into the 1850s.
Right. It did remind me though a little bit of goodness, I think it was Michael Holt's book, where he kind of makes the case that part of the changeover from the Whig Democratic Party system to the Republican Democratic system was sort of that you couldn't distinguish anymore between who is Whig, what does a Whig stand for, and what Democrats stand for. And it seems like that comes out with sort of Lincoln's criticism there of the candidates not standing like with any principle.
Well, I mean, Holt makes a case, and I agree with this. Part of the problem with the Whigs by the 1852 election, they were trying to avoid the two major issues that were on people's minds were slavery and immigration. The large number of immigrants coming to the United States, and then the anti-immigrant sentiment. Those were the two big issues in the 1850s. Lincoln, of course, wanted to emphasize the slavery issue and downplay immigration. But the Whigs in 1852 wanted to avoid both of those issues, and as a result, they were pretty much running on fumes at that point.
Right. What do you run
And
on?
so,
It's you avoid the biggest issues of the time, right?
yeah,
Like, that would be today, like, oh, I'm going to ignore immigration. I'm going to ignore abortion. I'm going to ignore
yeah,
like military conflict in Ukraine. I'm just going to like
right.
be in, have my head in the clouds.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, you could say that um, candidates and parties today that say let's ignore all these divisive issues and just come together on the fact that we're all Americans. That's just an empty answer.
Right.
That's like the John Bell's candidacy 1860 election.
Union
Let's
Party.
let's ignore the slavery issue and let's just come together in support of the Constitution. Well, but people had radically different ideas about what the Constitution said about slavery. And if you don't address those, this idea of coming to the center and let's all get along doesn't get you anywhere.
No.
I think Lincoln understood that political parties were a way of making a choice
Mhm.
on deeply divided questions, a way making the choice peacefully rather than violently. But those issues could be very, the slavery issue, what to do
Mhm.
about slavery was a really important issue. It had to be decided one way or another.
Mhm.
And the only way um, the only way that you could decide that nationally was this if there was a major political party that took that stance that
Right.
slavery should be the expansion of slavery should be stopped,
Mhm.
and that was in a position then for people to cast their votes.
Right.
I mean, before the Republican Party, there were many people who were very troubled about slavery. There was no major party for whom they could cast their votes. The abolitionist parties never
Right.
received more than a small fraction of the votes. The Republican Party was, for the first time, millions of Americans who were troubled by slavery could cast their votes for a party that actually had an opportunity of winning. And that is so parties have to take stances on
Mhm.
deeply divisive issues.
Right.
And, you know, I make the case in the book that for Lincoln, this was a major political party taking a stance on slavery was the only peaceful route
Yeah.
of resolving the slavery issue.
Mhm.
And of course, it didn't work out that way. Even the peaceful election of a Republican candidate was enough for the slave states of the lower South to say we're not playing by the rules anymore.
Yeah.
But at least Lincoln's hope was that if there is a peaceful route to the end of slavery, it's going to have to be in this kind of way through a
Right.
political party taking a clear public stance, then being rewarded by the voters
Mhm.
for its stance, and then being able then to actually put policies into place.
Yeah.
I mean, I could say this is another difference with political parties. For political parties, for Lincoln, could not just be grandstanding. They
Mhm.
couldn't just be taking positions to feed the emotions of their base. They had to, if the voters trusted them with their votes
Mhm.
and elected them, they had to be able and willing to deliver on at
Right.
least some of what their platform prescribed.
And we could go down a modern rabbit hole again with
Yeah.
that. And but I think that that leads to the other point that was very fascinating in your book with regard to Lincoln, where you kind of say that Lincoln understands a very important dynamic here that this is not going to be a permanent issue, that right now voters see slavery as an issue, and you have to capitalize on it now
Mm-hmm.
because in 10 years, it may be another issue.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think he believed it would take longer than 10 years. I think he believed the slavery
Yeah.
issue. Well, that his word was once the public mind has to come to agreement that slavery will be put in course of ultimate extinction.
Mhm.
Once, in a sense, those policies are in place, we can talk about what some of the specifics of that might have been. Then I think he considered it natural that attention would turn back to other issues. I mean, the the during the 1850s, the other major issue was immigration in the United States. You had an enormous number of immigrants coming, especially from Germany and Ireland, who were changing the American culture. In the case of the Irish and many of the Germans, they were Catholic, which threatened the Protestant majority in the United States. Many of these immigrants, there were many of them were very rowdy. And so it was a legitimate issue what you do about immigration. Lincoln himself was very pro-immigrant. He made great efforts with large degree of success to enlist the German immigrants in support of the Republican Party. The Irish immigrants were mostly already mostly supporting the Democratic Party, but he was very insistent about getting the support of the German immigrants. He had many of his major speeches translated into German. Right. He subsidized the publication of a German language political newsletter. But at the same time, Lincoln needed the support of the anti-immigrant voters. So because many of what they called the know-nothings, the anti-immigrant voters were also anti-slavery. Lincoln found this combination puzzling because he believed that all men are created equal, prohibited disenfranchising, discriminating against people for any reason. But practically speaking, in order to build this Republican Party that was going to be effective in halting and eventually shrinking slavery, he needed both the votes of pro-immigrant anti-slavery voters and anti-immigrant anti-slavery voters. And Lincoln managed, in his party building, managed to pull that off by emphasizing, and this is one of the points of his House Divided speech of 1858. The only issue he mentions is slavery. Right. And I think that's deliberate on his part. Everyone knew that immigration was still in the background there. It continued to be an issue through the Republican convention in 1860, but Lincoln was persistently saying to both sides of the immigration debate, the slavery issue is the most important one. We have to address this. Right. And I think going back to your original point, I think Lincoln understood there was almost something unnatural about this coalition. That if slavery could be solidly put in course of ultimate extinction, then it's almost natural that the differences between this coalition are going to come out, and maybe they will find expression in different parties.
Right. It almost reminds me of the first of the podcast episode when I talked to Frank Cirillo of the abolitionist Civil War, and like as soon as emancipation happens, this abolitionist alliance just falls to pieces of like how far do we want to go, and that's like considering the Republican Party has all these component pieces. It's a realistic fear.
I think that is a natural tendency in democratic politics, but it also shows how much careful, deliberate effort has to be put into making those coalitions work, even if they don't work forever. If you can get them to work for 10 years or 20 years, that's a major accomplishment. Right. And Lincoln put so much thought and effort into making the Republican Party work as a party that included both pro and anti-immigrant. It included abolitionists at one side, and at the other end, people who, as long as he stopped the spread of slavery, they weren't troubled by it. Yeah. So he had to keep all of these very different factions working together. So because Lincoln believed from the beginning that there was in sentiment, in moral sentiment, there was a majority of the American public, even a majority of the white public, who knew that slavery was wrong. But if you can't get that majority to work together politically, they cease to be a majority. And they will be defeated by a minority who is more committed and more organized. So that's why for Lincoln, putting together a national enduring anti-slavery coalition was so important, and his party building was so important, and his being strategic about what issues the party would focus on was important.
Well, you already kind of raised the issue that I was going to ask next about, because that's he very much emphasized that human element of like, let's have sympathy for these enslaved people in the South. Like, not like, we're not going to look at it as competition economically. We're not going to look at it as like what's going to happen. We're not going to talk yet about like civil rights. We're just going to focus that this is an unnatural state.
Yeah.
So it
think,
feels a little bit like least common denominator, but it's very much playing on human sympathy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yes. So Lincoln, and this goes, you get this very well in his 1854 speech against the Kansas-Nebraska Act, that he believed that the vast majority of human beings, even in the South, recognized that an enslaved person was a human being. That you have a suffering human being, that there is, even though legally they are a piece of property, you actually know that is not the case. That natural sympathy, it can be dampened by economic self-interest. It can be deadened. He also admitted there were some people that didn't feel it. He called them natural tyrants. So I think he would include slave traders, slave dealers as these natural tyrants who really did not feel these human sympathies, but he thought most people did. And so it was a least common denominator, but it helped that he believed almost all human beings were capable of these sympathies and that they could be invoked. On top of that, but really as a separate kind of motivation, he believed it was true and possible to persuade white Americans, white non-slaveholding Americans, that the expansion and perpetuation of slavery threatened their rights and their economic self-interest. So Lincoln is, in a sense, both enlisting a kind of disinterested sympathy for an enslaved person as a fellow human being, and a self-interest argument. Because he probably realized, I mean, the self-interested is a stronger motive, but it also needs to be explained.
Right.
So, what your self-interest is not as immediately obvious. So self-interest just requires reasoned explanation. Sympathy has the advantage that it's pre-rational. Both of those, he believed, were necessary motivational supports for building an anti-slavery majority. And then, particularly on the side of northern white workers, I think this is really important. I think one of the things that my book brings out, more than other books on Lincoln have, is how Lincoln was very deliberate about trying to persuade white northern workers who were not slaveholders that the abolition of slavery did not threaten their interest, and in fact actually advance their interest. So, I mean, what was he arguing against? I think many of the white workers would say, well, I don't like slavery, but if slavery is abolished, all those former slaves will come up here and compete with me for a job, in the same way that people in many places are afraid of immigrants coming in and competing with them for jobs. And so the white northern working class people whose votes were essential to Lincoln to try to stop the spread of slavery were very susceptible to this argument that the black man's economic advancement will come at their expense.
Right.
And Lincoln said no. Actually, the abolition of slavery would improve your situation and raise your wages. Right now, you are already competing with them because this is a national economy. You are competing with them. They are working for free.
Yeah.
So you are competing with somebody who is free labor because who is being paid zero wages because it's forced labor. If slavery is abolished, they will certainly no longer work for zero pay. They will demand wages. If they demand wages, that will the black workers' wages going up will also cause white workers' wages to go up. And there, in that sense, you have a direct economic self-interest in abolishing slavery because it is actually slavery that is pulling your wages down, not the color of the skin of the person who you may be competing with for a job. And in economic terms, competing with a black person is no different from competing with a white person for a job. The only thing that makes a difference is if those black people are enslaved and working for free. So Lincoln worked hard to make that argument, both before the Civil War and in 1862, on the eve of the Emancipation Proclamation. He made that argument again. And Lincoln's argument, and chapter 6 of my book uses this as a title phrase: "The plank is large enough." So this is from speeches that Lincoln was giving in 1859, 1860, where he said, some people think that relations between the black man and the white man are like two shipwrecked sailors, and there is only one plank, and only one person can fit on the plank, and the only way the white man can survive is by pushing the black man off. And Lincoln says, if that were the case, it wouldn't make any difference what the race of the other person was. I would push a white man off a black man if I had to survive. But he says that is not the case. The plank is large enough. Our economy is not such that the black man can only gain at white man's expense. No, that we have an economy, a free labor economy, is one in which people can gain prosperity together.
Right.
And Lincoln worked hard to make that argument in his own time, and I think the argument needs to be is still relevant to the United States today. It's still the case in the United States that a large percentage of white Americans see black Americans' economic gains as coming at their expense, and I think it was not the case in 1860, and it's not the case today.
No, I was just going to say that too. That's like it's still an issue, and it still holds true that there is for everyone a space to survive and live and have a happy being.
Right.
Of course, that in parts, though, I kind of, as you were talking, I was thinking also towards the other part, towards the end of your book now, where this now kind of starts to little backfire on Lincoln. He found that common denominators that we have the sympathy and self-interest, but he didn't have the public behind him then to go the next step and say, let's give African Americans, these formerly enslaved people, also then civil rights. Right. So
and so Lincoln he believed that most white Americans were capable of recognizing enslaved persons as fellow human beings. He believed most white workers could be, with effort, could be persuaded that they could share a free labor market with black workers without any great harm to themselves. He did not believe the vast majority of white Americans would accept to be equal fellow citizens and voters with black Americans. Right. This contrasted with the abolitionists, Frederick Douglass, Wendell Phillips, who argued, for what justice really prescribes is that every person regardless of race, should be given a vote. And Lincoln's own principles, as I mentioned, his own principles going back to his statement in his 1854 Kansas-Nebraska speech that all human beings are entitled to equal participation in the laws by which they're governed. So Lincoln never made or even attempted to make a principled argument as to why only white people should have the vote. His only argument was that in practice, white Americans are dead set against it. I don't know how to change that.
Right.
And, you can still, I don't think, I would not dispute the accuracy of the statement. It was empirically an accurate statement. You can argue, you can criticize Lincoln for not challenging it more than he did. And, it's good that there were abolitionists out there challenging it and helping to create a different climate of public opinion. But I think that the major changes in public opinion that made the 14th and 15th Amendments possible, 14th Amendment equal protection of the law, 15th Amendment voting rights, came during the Civil War itself. Mm-hmm. And people were in the North were so angry at the slaveholders right. that they were willing to go further than they would have before the war. Yeah. And then, really important, the fact that Black men in enormous numbers fought for the Union, yeah. Gave them a stake, so that by the end of the war, Lincoln is arguing that comes out in support for Black voting rights, beginning with those who served in the military. And there's some evidence that John Wilkes Booth was already plotting, but there's some evidence that this may have put him over the top. That it was citizenship and voting rights, right. more than just the abolition of slavery, that was the reason why he assassinated Lincoln.
Yeah, well, and I think that's kind of going back to Frank's books that I interviewed a couple of weeks ago, of this notion that the abolitionists themselves don't help the cause much either. They say break apart over what direction should we take after emancipation, and guys like Garrison saying, well, emancipation right. happened, we're done, we're right. out of here. And it's a very sad reality at the end of the war, of you give freedom, but what next?
Right. Well, I would just say, in defense, semi-defense of the abolitionists, those were really difficult problems too. And if Lincoln had been assassinated, Lincoln would have had to address those same extremely difficult problems. But sure. I would say too that, the abolitionists, they were very, their approach was very moralistic. Mm-hmm. And that was both a strength and a weakness, in the sense that they were, many of them, motivated by religious conviction, mm-hmm. and they wanted to speak the truth regardless of consequences, leave the consequences to God. And you need people like that. I mean, they played an essential role in helping to turn public opinion against slavery. But people like that are also not disposed to make that kinds of compromises right. that effective legislation depends upon. Right. So the abolitionists, unfortunately, even before the war, were very factionalized. Right. They all agreed that slavery was evil, but they had doctrinal differences among themselves that prevented their working together very effectively. And so, whereas Lincoln, as we've already talked about, Lincoln understood that to build a majority, you had to bring together people who disagreed among themselves on many things. You have to find some way. You can't actually silence the disagreements, but you find whatever is the priority thing that they can agree upon, and emphasize that, and de-emphasize the disagreements. And the abolitionists were not as good as that, as that side of politics, as Lincoln was.
Yeah, agreed. All right. Now, before we start the recording, you did mention that you did want to briefly talk about the cover of your book. I will, for those who are watching it as a video, I will bring it up. For those who are just listening in to us, the book cover is George Caleb Bingham's The County Election 1854, which I'll put a link into the description of the podcast for that as well. But Jim, why is that picture especially for your cover? What
it is
so...
well, I wanted a cover for the book that was not just another image of Lincoln that people have seen hundreds of times before.
We appreciate that.
Yeah. So, and in this case, what you see in the cover of the book is a picture of a local election in Missouri, which was an adjoining state. This is very much like what Lincoln would have participated in many times in Illinois, and it pictures a whole community. And you see in the painting, you see people going up to the county clerk and reporting their votes. Most American states did not have a secret ballot at that point in time. So that is accurate to the way elections were carried out. And then you see many different people. And in certain ways, this is like, Bruegel paintings, where you see a whole community and all of its characters. I think that this is an American kind of equivalent of that, that there are some people and that you see in there on sort of the right side of the panel who appear well-educated, having very thoughtful discussions of important issues. On the left side, you see people getting drunk.
Yes,
which also
I always enjoy that part of that picture.
It was actually one of the scandals that some candidates, would ply their supporters with alcohol as a way of winning their votes. This is part of the reason why in many states for a long time the states banned bars, closed down bars and liquor sales on election day. Yes. So all of the voters featured are men. There's no women there reporting their vote. That was, unfortunately also the case in the 1850s, that women were not permitted to vote. At the far left of the panel, there's a black man who is serving somebody. We don't know if he's free or enslaved. Missouri was a slave state, but he could have also been a free person of color. So this is a picture of the whole community. It's not a perfect community. It has its flaws, and yet Lincoln trusted the voters that with all their flaws, this was the best way to make decisions, certainly compared to any other alternative. And so that's why I chose that for the cover of the book.
Yeah, and I always, when I taught this picture every time when I did the United States during that period, and we also looked at like that guy at the top of the stairs there, kind of trying at the last minute to influence a voter, or like the guy that seems to be like passed out, being carried to the stairs to pass his vote. And it's such a beautiful picture to kind of talk about the election environment, and also kind of how difficult democracy is.
Yes, and there's you can't read it so much in the cover of the book, but there's a blue banner above where people are reporting their votes. The blue banner says "The will of the people."
Oh, jeez, I didn't. Yeah. Perfect. Majority rule, the sovereignty of the people that we have. My gosh, it's such a fascinating topic, and so currently relevant. again that
Yes, I would say that it's disturbingly relevant in the United States.
yes.
Usually,
It's,
I think authors think it's good or happy if their book has relevance.
mhm.
In my case, the relevance of this book is a cause of deep anxiety to me.
I can see that. I can very much see that. And I think many Civil War historians looking at the current situation and knowing what we went through in the 1860s are worried of
Mhm.
what is happening currently. Yeah, it is rather disturbing. Um, I'm going to ask now because you already have this was your fourth book.
Yeah.
What's the next one going to be?
Well, the next book, I have sort of this dual as a writer. Both one side of me is in history of American political thought, and the other one is in theorizing about the nature of political power, and in particular,
Oh,
whether political power should be understood as zero sum or variable sum. Zero sum being one's gain
oh,
is another's loss.
yeah,
Variable sum that it's possible for people to either gain power together or lose power together, and there are connections between those things. I mean,
yeah.
Lincoln's saying rejecting the idea that there was just one plank and you can only
Mm-hmm.
save yourself by throwing the other off. He was saying, no, this is not a zero sum
Right.
situation. So
Mm.
my next book is really going back to something that was my doctoral dissertation and the source of many articles over the years is a systematic examination of the question of whether power should be understood as zero sum or variable sum and making
Mm-hmm.
an argument for a variable sum understanding of power. So that does
Wow.
have connections with my the other side of my professional work in the history of American political thought.
Yeah, wow, that sounds very fascinating. And again, definitely sort of like as so many people in politics, especially public activists, think in those zero-sum terminologies, a very important word to add, to kind of say, no, no, no. We all lose when you do something. And I think some
Yeah,
recent decisions are very much illustrative of that.
yeah,
That unfortunately is what we sometimes forget about. So
yeah.
but with that, let's come to an end here. It was a great pleasure, Jim, to have you today on the podcast.
Well,
Um,
thank you for inviting me. I would like to say to any listeners, you are welcome to email me with questions, thoughts. Um, uh, I have a website, James H. Reed Author .com. You can also email me JREAD at csbsju.edu. That's my university address. I welcome your thoughts and observations, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
yeah, I may actually bring you back in a few months to kind of talk more about
Okay.
secession and intellectual thought.
Yes,
That's something
yes,
that very
yeah,
much
that's
interests me.
the whole secession issue. There's a whole nother conversation for that one.
Oh yes, yeah. Once the craziness of my summer goes by, I'll be back. But just as a kind of reminder, if you're interested in Jim's book, it's the Sovereign of a Free People, Abraham Lincoln, Majority Rule and Slavery, published by the University Press of Kansas. And you can find it at the press website or at various other locations. Again, thank you so much, Jim. I hope you have a
Thank you.
wonderful day
You
and
too.
enjoy the rest of the semester.
Yes, you too.